Next on our presentation, there is a presentation by Ágnes Kövér-Van, who is a lawyer and sociologist from Hungary. She is also associate professor and director of the Institute of Social Studies, program director of Gender Studies MA program at ELTE University School of Social Science in Budapest, Hungary, where she teaches employment, police law, women and labor market policy, diversity and deviance in gender discourse analysis. She is also has a distinguished career as a non-profit organization executive and human rights lawyer in Hungary, and she is also an author and editor of several books and numerous articles on topics like gender discourse, equal treatment and opportunities, and minority rights. And the topic she will discuss is double attack on civil society in the era of COVID-19. You may start.
Okay. Can I share a presentation, a PPT with you?
Of course, you can share.
How can I do that?
You can press share screen on your.
Okay, I try share screen. All right. Okay. Oh, here. Share. Okay, we use Teams application, you know, so that's another system, and I have no that much experience in Zoom. Can you see?
Yes, we can see.
Okay, that's wonderful. I'll try to move a little bit closer to here. Okay. No. Okay, so I'm going to speak about civil society in the next 40 minutes. And I think civil society is incredibly important, independently from that fact whether we speak about formalized civil society, so civil movements, not registered civil organizations and civil groups, or we speak about formalized civil organizations that I will refer in this lecture as CSOs, civil society organizations. Okay, so when I say these CSOs, it will mean registered, mostly registered organizations, associations, foundations, and so on. You know, it's depend on the national law. So I think the civil society in the institutions and the civil society itself has a pivotal role in somehow changing the current world order and reducing the risks of our societies and take over the control those untamed or unbridled forces which took over recently the world and ruled the world. I mean, these kind of forces like market and money on the one hand, and power, state power, political parties or governmental power, autocratic power on the other hand. So I think only civil society has the capacity or any kind of promise to take over somehow the power from these efforts or from these forces. So let me show you, but of course civil society is under attack, and this attack was absolutely unfortunately reinforced and increased during the COVID-19. And I will show you the results of an empirical research which showed both sides of, or both kinds of threats or intimidations that could come from, which could attack civil society. And on this way, I would speak about some theoretical frames and empirical findings of an international research which was conducted in 2020 and the beginning of 2021. So let me share with you, or maybe only remind you at the beginning, some theoretical standpoints or some theoretical theoretical frames. Probably these frames are very well known. I mean, I hope you all are aware of these ideas. One of them is Parsons' Agile model, which is his frame of the social structure. So you see this picture here, where the A is the adaptation, which is the economy and the market. And immediately I try to refer to Habermas's thoughts, because Habermas built his theory of communicative action on this a little bit modified version of the Parsons social structure. So adaptation, economy, and market at Habermas is money. The G in the Agile is government and political power, obviously, so the state power, in other words, which is power in the context of Habermas' thoughts. The I is the civil society. This is the place of integration, social integration. This is the civil society. The L is the latent pattern transmission, which is family. So this is the space where human being actually socialized and learns all those human gender patterns and norms and roles at the same time that is available in the society. So this is the basic, very simple model, which was in certain ways improved and developed in a different direction by Jürgen Habermas about 30 years later than the original model was invented by Parsons. So he, as I referred so far, the upper two, okay, I go back a little bit, the upper two elements, the A, the economy, market, adaptation, and the government, G, in the Habermas's theory is the system, he calls it system, and the lower two boxes, the latent pattern transmission, the family, and the integration, the civil society, he called life world. And as Parsons stated that, I mean, in this model, all boxes or all elements has their function, and somehow a kind of balance should be work in a society among these elements. But exactly this was what Habermas used, and he told these elements are very rare to be in balance, but usually the upper two elements, the system, has the tools to somehow colonize the life world, mainly the civil society and the family as well. But in this case, in our case now, we are mostly dealing with civil society issues. So somehow the money, the market, on the one hand, and the government, the political power, the state, on the other hand, have the power and have the tools, which is very important, to colonize the system of life world, the civil society. So what we mean under civil society? I mean, what does it mean, this word? Civil society, not the civil society, so sorry, the life world first and then civil society. Okay, so life world, according to Habermas, is space for shared common understandings, including values, that develops through face-to-face contacts over time in various social groups, from families to communities, small groups. The life world carries all sorts of assumptions about who we are as people and what we value about ourselves, what we believe, what shocks and offends us, what we aspire to and what we desire, what we are willing to sacrifice, to which ends, and so on. So this life world is pretty important, as we see, but pretty much vulnerable, as we are going to see. So why colonization is so dangerous, and what does it mean if the life world is colonized? Again, we turn to Habermas, and we think that the colonization of life world generates a high risk, a pretty high crisis in the society, which he called legitimation crisis. So if life world is dominated by its media, by the media of systems like money and power, then somehow the legitimacy of the whole system, of the whole society, is in crisis. So somehow Habermas called this upper two parts, the market or the money and the political power, as a kind of quantitative media, which he thinks quantitative, contrary to the qualitative media of the life world, which is value of commitment, which are the acts of influence, and of course values of the society. So this what is legitimation means for Habermas, and why it is important for us. It is important because it means that citizens somehow have the sense that the institutions within which their life going on, so these institutions are just, benevolent, in their best interest, and deserving of their support, loyalty, and adherence. These are very important, and obviously these features part and this legitimacy is clearly linked to a balanced social order. So if we lose this legitimacy, people actually lose their belief in the whole system, and it has a lot of negative consequences, obviously. But what does it mean? How this kind of how these values and features of life world can come through? What kind of processes has to happen in the society? And this is the thing Habermas called communicative action. So, and he worked out and devised the ideal speech situation which might restore legitimacy of the upper two, the money and the power in the society. So somehow this kind of ideal communicative action, so open communication in public space would somehow restore all those feelings that for the citizens that needs to have for a good society. So this legitimacy requires that citizens understand each other as committed to continuing the process of seeking common understanding and acting with respect for that ongoing process. So this is an ongoing process. This kind of public deliberation and public communication, public discourse is an absolutely ongoing process which has to happen in each society. With money and votes, I mean, this is the quantity of the power, votes, you never seek to reach understanding. That was he told. You only invoke how much quantitative you have got and thus overpower and be overpowered. But it doesn't mean a balanced democratic society where the life word is an active participant of the society. The problem with that, and this is what partly Habermas devised only, what to do with authoritarianism, and especially populist authoritarianism, which is pretty much prevalent in our societies recently and getting more and more prevalent. So this populist authoritarianism divides society pretty highly, tries to create hegemony in the Gramscian sense by oppressing significant social groups, and this is somehow the opposite of the communicative action, where people can talk about their differences, they can have common understanding about their personal differences, interest differences, and somehow the authoritarianism and the authoritarian regimes just eliminate or totally diminish or seize that public space where this communicative action could happen and where all the right-word interests, values could be shaped in a discourse process or communication process. So this colonization, I mean, usually, of course, authoritarianism is the very clear colonization of power, but in some cases, or most of the cases, not without money and not without the economic phase. Sometimes it is colonization of the economic field too. So this colonization reduces the sphere in which communicative and qualitative media operate, and more of social life depends on non-communicative and quantitative media. So somehow the money and the direct power forces take over that whole society. So these features and operations of populist authoritarianism generate political risks and ended up with withering of democracy, civil society, and civil activism. And this risk cannot be generated just on national level, but very much on international level, which actually intimidate international peace. So in cases when the autocrats are not controlled by people and by legal institutions and the institutions of rule of law and publicity and public space. So these kind of uncontrolled autocrats are able to launch, for instance, war, as we can experience now, which threaten even the future of the whole civilization. Unfortunately, not very long term, it could happen. It could happen with us in a very short term. So the second theoretical frame, as the whole conference is about the Beck's risk society concept, the little change and little modification somehow try to mix together the Habermasian and the Beck's risk society idea. And I think colonization of life work creates a crisis which generates societal political risk of diminishing and withering democracy, as I mentioned. And we are going to see later how populist authoritarianism can colonize, with what tools and means can colonize civil society and undermine civil participation in civic activism. On the other hand, the distribution of these social risks are uneven also, because the consequences are taken very differently by the elite groups and the subordinated groups of the society. So now, going through step by steps on the thoughts that I try to prepare for you, the next question is why civil society organizations and civil society itself are so important for us. And of course, this is the democracy concept. So there are a lot of theory about what role civil society plays in, for instance, in the third wave democracies, or in democracy, or in developing and maintaining democracy itself. I don't want to list these, but there are some, just mentioned some of them. There are some ideas which thinks the major role of civil society is not to set up democracy, but to stabilize democracy. But I would like to use here Walzer's civil society argument, which says only a democratic state can create a democratic civil society, and only democratic civil society can sustain a democratic state. The civility that makes democratic politics possible can only be learned in the associational networks. So this definition actually contains two major things, which is the democratic state. Somehow the prerequisite of democratic state is democratic civil society, and the reverse, the prerequisite of democratic civil society is democratic state, because of course democratic state and democratic government can nurture civil society, can reinforce civil society movements, and there are a lot of possibilities for cooperation with civil society. And of course, on the other hand, through participation and cooperation, civil society can create or can be part of the democratic state and democratic governance and government. But somehow we experience that weak civil society, in some case, weak civil society constitutes democratic states, and democratic states constitute weak civil society. These are the exceptional phenomena. Mostly this this way of connection is, I would say, one-way connection. So democratic society and democratic civil society and democratic state come together. And yeah, in the last part of this definition, which is about, this is actually a Tocquevillian thought, somehow considers the associational networks and civil society as the school of democracy, where people can be socialized to be good citizen. And this is the next step that I would like to show you, the 4 concepts or the 4 functions of civil society, which all are pretty important and which all have relevance in the current civil societies and civil organizations, CSOs, in case of CSOs. So one is the liberal concept, which comes from the 17th century, traced back to John Locke's ideas and thoughts. And the main feature of this concept, or the main characteristics of the concept, is that it is actually a kind of confrontational concept, which set the state on one hand and civil society on the other hand as something which has a lot of contradictions and which has to confront with each other. So civil society has to protect the independence and the autonomy of citizens, and has to protect their rights. And as I told, this is a confrontative concept. So these are the organizations which we call watchdog organizations, organizations which try to protect certain groups' interests or represent certain groups' interests. So this is a very important function of the civil society. And on the other hand, it is also very important to somehow check out, to control the state. So state cannot go without civil society control. Actually, this is the function that usually authoritarian governments, and sometimes not just authoritarian governments, do not like very much. They a little bit more, much more, or more prefer the pluralistic concept, which is a kind of complementary mode of working. So here civil society organizations are involved in resolving social conflicts and relieving the state by taking over important human, social, and health services, for instance. And in this case, the emphasis is on the cooperation between the two actors. And the third one is the third function and concept, as I mentioned before, the Tocquevillian's democracy concept, where the NGOs, the CSOs, civil society organizations are active creators of democracy, and the scene, they provide the scene for the socialization to be a good and active citizen. And this kind of, he actually lists a whole different kind of features and characteristics which are important from this perspective. So citizens can learn in the civil society organizations different virtues like tolerance, cooperation, respect of each other's, willingness to compromise, honesty, reliability, and so on and so on. So, all in all, civil society organizations in this concept and in these functions are part of strengthening democracy, or the main actor for strengthening democracy. The neo-Weberian concept emphasizes a little bit different thing, which say that civil society creates a kind of pre-political space in which social interests can be expressed, especially the voice of disadvantaged groups, which can thus appear in public discourse. Otherwise, their voice are somehow unmuted and not listened. They are marginalized. Most of the cases, they are marginalized. These are marginalized groups in the society. So, and a very important role of this function of civil society in the societies is that they are able to thematize the conflicts and able to deal with or have discourse about the solution of the social conflicts, all the social problems that they thematize. So we call it actually voice of amplifier concept. So I think all these functions are very important, equally important for the civil society. And we can see if we look at look around in our societies and we see our NGOs and CSOs, then we see different kind of non-governmental organizations, service provider organizations, which is the complementary, refers the complementary concept, of course, the interest representation, and the watchdog power control function at the same time, and so on. So these are all parallel with each other, existing, and all these functions are very important. And the next question is whether all civil society and whether under what conditions civil society can meet with these expectations or can fulfill these functions that I listed so far. And we told all these functions are equally important. So the answer is these roles and these functions of civil society and civil organizations, which are closer, which are crucial for democracy. So they can only be fulfilled by an independent and autonomous civil society. So there are two very important features again, and I'm going to list some more, which, for instance, partnership and solidarity, which are crucial and inevitable for civil society to be able to fulfill those functions, which are the functions of the civil society in the societies. So, as I mentioned, there are certain features and characteristic or traits: autonomy, partnership, and inward and outward solidarity. So what we think about autonomy of civil society and civil organizations? It refers to a balance between autonomy from the state and autonomy from the market. So it should be free from the influence and the jeopardy of the state or political power and the money and the market on the other side. As well as this autonomy rule or feature emphasizes all of norms of trust and reciprocity, which has to happen, has to present in civil society. This autonomy of civil society in particular depends on its ability to protect itself against both subsystems, as I mentioned, the market, since it is jeopardized directly by the state, the governmental power, and the colonizing tendencies of economic forces. Of course, the resource dependency is something that really subjects civil society and civil organizations especially to both the governmental and the market intrusion. But somehow there are some solutions, maybe legal solutions, that can partly, at least partly, solve this problem. The second thing is which is inevitable for civil society is the independence, its independence. So the autonomy and independence link together deeply, obviously. Of course, it is, as I mentioned, means an independent decision-making, independent way of acting, of course, collaboration in collaboration or cooperation with different other social organizations and social groups like market organizations and state organizations, but very important that to somehow ensure and provide or fight for the independence of this civil society, of the civil society. The partnership is the next thing, which is it's a way of power sharing in decision making, policy making, policy implementing level, and we know very well those word the word of participative governance, which means the active participation of civil society organizations and through this citizens into the policy planning and policy implementing process. This is also a very important part of this participation and cooperation with the policy making, local policy and national policy making process. And I think participation is a very inevitable feature for the civil society. So solidarity is the last one I would like to mention, and solidarity somehow embodied in norms of reciprocity and common interests as mutual support within, among groups, civil society and society groups. So there are two different parts of this solidarity according to the literature. One is the inward solidarity, which actually refers to a quality of human association, specifically the cohesive social bond that holds the member of an organization together in an association based on some level of conscious or intentional commitment. This is called group identification. But the inward solidarity encompasses also the sectoral solidarity, which means a cooperation among CSOs, NGOs. So they cooperation for achieving collective goals, which transcend the interest of the individual organization. So the capacity and the ability of organizations to cooperate and coordinate their actions for higher purposes. The outward solidarity is also very interesting. This is a kind of external solidarity, which means civil society is a kind of counterweight of the unresponsive or authoritarian state. So in this way, citizens can pressure authoritarians for change, protect themselves from tyranny, and democratize from below. So this outward solidarity is a kind of sector solidarity against the overpowered state activity or overpowered state. I would like to introduce you this research that we conducted in 2020, as I mentioned, among the participants of the research were 9 countries. You see the countries listed here. And we try to see how all these basic features and basic elements of civil society worked during the COVID-19 in certain countries. And we actually found very interesting results, and our original hypothesis was reinforced, according to which we thought in a country where mostly the power colonizes the life world and civil society, COVID-19 and all those measures, emergency rules and so on, just strengthened and disproportionately strengthened discolonization and reinforced the authoritarian manners and operation mode. We found some countries which were between the two, the authoritarian and the, I would say, much more money-ruled and market-ruled kind of civil society and societies. And the third type of institutions or countries where we found that they were already subjected to growing marketization, and the civil society was subjected to growing marketization, which was actually, which became more serious during the pandemic governmental decisions and actions. So these are the three main groups of countries that we found. So a little bit more detailed about the findings of this research. The growing authoritarianism characterized, of course, China, Turkey, and Hungary. And we found the so-called 4C models come into effect. The 4C model is cooptation, coercion, crowding out, and creation. Cooptation means the act or the instance of coopting the civil society organizations, taking them over or appropriating them for a new or different purpose. So somehow in these countries, the authoritarian countries, part of civil society is co-opted by the government and by the political forces, and they use them to make themselves legitimate. Coercion, of course, use legal tools, mostly legal tools, for restricting and enabling civil society, civil activism, not enabling, disabling, restricting and disabling civil society and civil activism. Crowding out means, in most of the cases, that governmental organizations, even during the pandemic, were not able to and didn't want to cooperate with civil society organizations. They didn't provide opportunity them to help people, to work in social services or to work on the social service field. And all these tasks are passed to the church, mostly the church organizations. So somehow crowding out means that state or political power builds its social policy, sometimes health policy, and societal policy, much rather on church organizations than the independent and autonomous civil society organizations. And creation means creating new loyal civil organizations. We call them gongos. So, which means that governmental efforts and political power provides a lot of financial and other resources for organizations or set up organizations, or those organizations who are clearly support their policy, their authoritarian policy. I think the effects of these 4C policies were very clearly reinforced during the pandemic and during the COVID-19 era by the emergency ruling and rules and emergency governance, which led to, as I mentioned before, a disproportionate strength of the executive power. And the exceptional legal order, which was introduced, was used by the governments not only to deal with the epidemic or the pandemic, but for different other purposes. I tell the examples country by country. For instance, in Hungary, these rules was used to shrink LGBTQI rights. Emergency legislation, for example, has curtailed the rights of transgender people to change their name by amending the Registry Act. The concept of birth sex was created instead of the previous sex, which cannot be changed afterward. I know this is a small part of society, but this is a tendency. You know how somehow power and authoritarian government use the emergency rules, which purpose is to protect the nation, the people against the pandemic and help to build up a system which helps to attain this purpose. So instead of this, certain groups are attacked and without parliamentary consent and without any kind of public discourse, certain groups are targeted with administrative rules. Similar things happened in Turkey when the fundraising actions of local opposition and local governments and local civil organizations were declared illegally by the central government. So these local organizations were not allowed to collect money, to raise money for people who were in incredibly bad situation and who needed help. They could not do that. Only the central government could fundraise money, and they collected all the resources and all the possible support, financial support, and other kind of support. And they used it in an exceptionalist way. So it was not a democratic way of using those resources. For instance, in China, these exceptional rules concluded in further exclusion of international NGOs from the country. And also the local NGOs and local civil organizations were restricted to get in touch, to interact with these international NGOs. So these NGOs were not allowed into the country and they could not interact. The international NGOs could not interact with the local organizations. Consequently, they could not help them. The second group of countries, what we found in this research, were less authoritarian, but still state-dominated. But we could see a kind of mixture of colonization by money and by power. And these two countries were Israel and India. So for instance, in Israel, the government's policies can be characterized by a lack of support for the work of NGOs and CSOs, often threatening their very survival. So the government did not support these organizations during the pandemic at all. And the basis of this governmental behavior is a kind of ambivalence and a kind of fear of civil society. And this ambivalence and fear, based on pretty well-known prejudices, one of them is that the CSOs, which operate on the basis of values of democracy, equality, freedom of expression, and the right to demonstrate and advocate for disadvantaged and excluded population, So these organizations undermine the stability of the government and the resilience of the country. This is actually, I mean, they think, I mean, this fear or governments thinks CSOs and NGOs subvert. They are subverting forces which undermine the governmental actions and the stability of the state. They somehow constitute a kind of shadow state or shadow government, which is opposite to the, or which has confrontative position to the governmental and political power. And that is why they don't support these organizations, and they did not support them during the pandemic, the COVID-19 era, or during that time that we observed. Another source of distrust in Israel and in this kind of governmental attitude is that when government perceives CSOs to be ineffective and inefficient, especially in comparison with for-profit organizations. And now this is the attack from the perspective of money, you know, and market. It is very interesting because this raises contradicting expectations, which directed towards the civil society organizations, which actually sets up a dangerous trap for them. Sometimes, for instance, in welfare, in the field of welfare system, government favors for-profit organizations only because of the distrust against the non-profit organizations, because they only strive to gain profit. And this feature makes them more transparent than the civil society organizations and makes them less threatening from the governmental perspective. So this is the second reason why somehow the for-profit organizations are supported much more by the governmental organizations, and this happened during the pandemic too. And of course, CSOs, civil society organizations, try to meet with the governmental expectations and try to move towards more market-based operation, which means they use more and more managerialism, public NPF, new public management tools, and so on, which goes against the main characteristics and features of civil organizations. So it is similar situation in India in a different way. In India, where there is a high cooperation between the governmental forces and civil organizations, but during the pandemics, it was a growing intolerance towards civil society, especially because of the critical voices they expressed towards the governmental behavior and governmental programs. For instance, government limited the public consultation on important social issues, which actually led to the passing of legislation and constitutional amendments that have worked to the detriment of environmental protection, labor, and farmers. The second, this kind of highly criticized thing was when the government actually again centralized all the money which originally was earmarked for other societal purposes like social welfare and so on, and the government channeled all these monies, which originally had a different purpose, channeled into one big governmental fund. And actually, not just this, but the international donors' donations were channeled into this big pool, and only the governmental forces could use these sources during the pandemic, and actually a lot of money was actually taken away from organizations which worked with poor population or migrated population. That was an incredible migration in India during the pandemic, because certain piece of economy was shut down, and people had to move back to their region because they couldn't make any kind of life in the place where they worked formerly. So they wanted to help these people, poor people and migrating people, and they didn't have any resource for doing this. And actually the state didn't find it a very important thing or very important social purpose to deal with. So they didn't care that very much that. So the third group of the countries we found where the phenomena of or the phenomenon of growing marketization could be found. So this is the growing risk of colonization by the market sphere. These were Germany, Austria, Great Britain, and partly South Korea. Very briefly, because I think the time is running. For instance, in Germany, we found that, or the researchers found that the government actually dealt with the non-profit organizations and non-profit service providers in the social domain as for-profits. So they were treated on equal footing with for-profit organizations, which actually gave or resulted in a lot of disadvantages for the non-governmental organizations. The second thing, what happened, both federal and regional governments treated non-profits as business, as I told, as market players. And there was a shift in membership-based organizations toward contract-like relationships. So somehow the commodification of social services happened, and so on. And also bureaucratic measures were not relaxed, which actually made very difficult, especially smaller organizations, to cope with the pandemic situation. Austria, actually in Austria, that was mostly positive. The pandemic and the COVID-19 had a positive impact on civil society organizations and the relation of government and civil and CSOs, because they created the so-called non-profit fund, which first time actually legally expressed that non-profit sector, or not just legally expressed, but legally recognized the non-profit sector in Austria. It was not recognized by the law before as a fund receiver or part of the society or organizations, fund receiver from the state, actually. So this was a very big step ahead, and this provided the Austrian organizations a lot of opportunity to provide help and to participate into mitigating the adverse, very bad consequences of COVID-19. But on the other hand, especially during the COVID-19, the researchers found a reinforcing way of state paternalism, which was really intensified during this period of time, and which affected very much the smaller CSOs and smaller organizations. Great Britain, this is a typical of liberal. These former two countries are this kind of cooperative countries, so the cooperation between the state and civil society organizations work on a cooperative way. So there is a high participation for the civil society organizations in the decision making and so on. But Great Britain is a little bit difficult. In the United, in the United Kingdom, the state left the resolution of COVID-19 raised problems mostly, or in the case of certain social groups, especially the most vulnerable social groups, exclusively to non-governmental organizations. Here, civil society found itself overwhelmed by the magnitude of tasks expected of it and assigned to it. So actually they had to take over those functions and roles that usually and other countries state do, and state's role to solve. Okay. They in UK, in the Great Britain, they also experienced a shift towards marketization very clearly, especially as a result of contract competition, professionalization. They have a very high level of managerialism, and the new public management is very much prevalent, and those rules are very much prevalent in the civil society organizations. And actually, it is true in their case too, the government dealt with CSOs if they were business organizations or market players. And the last experience from South Korea, where actually the much more balanced cooperation was implemented during, or the much more cooperation featured the relation of state and civil society. So civil society contributed to and contributes still in the governance, in a multi-sectoral partnership, and of course, they participate in public policy formulation, public policy implementation process, and their participation level is pretty high. And there are incredibly open spaces for public deliberation as well.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but
this is my last. This is my last. Oh, I didn't go. Okay, this is my last. These are my last thoughts and my summary at the same time. Our research actually indicated very clearly that the strong and autonomous and also independent civil society can be a very effective partner in time of crisis. Partner means, it is not a one layer of solving the problems. Of course, it needs to have cooperation among the governmental, the economic participants, and the civil society at the same time. So this it has to be a kind of cooperative and cooperation mode, which could be effective. And this crisis operation mode, we have to understand that became very much a kind of part of normality in our societies. So we have to reckon with that fact, crisis is normal, and we have to deal with this crisis, and we have to cooperate in solving the problems and in mitigating of the consequences of the crisis. So in all this, actually, civil society has an inevitable role. And also it became very clear that the relationship between civil society and state in the fight against the virus, chosen styles and strategies expanded the pre-existing forms and patterns and intensified and perhaps even increased their clarification, which means that where the risk of being colonized by the power was stronger, there the colonization by state became stronger. Where the risk of being colonized by the market was stronger, there the colonization by money and market became stronger. So this is the result of our work, and this is all that I wanted to show you. The double attack on civil society, which was actually became much more intensified during the pandemic. Okay.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Now we have 10 minutes for discussion. So any questions on Zoom? If anybody has a question on Zoom, they can write in chat. And if anybody has a question in the audience, they can raise a hand. Yeah.
I have a question about your research. Which method did you use?
Yeah, we devised a questionnaire on the one hand, and we covered several hundred civil society organizations. So we the questionnaire was available through internet in each countries, and we had a lot of organizations who filled this questionnaire on the one hand. On the other hand, we prepared interviews with civil organizations, civil society organizations representatives. Especially, we wanted to see certain details, and we wanted to see how civil society organizations could resolve the problems were raised or were made by the crisis, by the COVID, the pandemic. And also we made interviews with governmental representatives and representatives of market organizations. And the last method was we did some research, documentum research, and collective data about the sums that governments used for solving the national problems. So, and also the documents, the legal documents and other documents, what was relevant from the perspectives of civil society. And yes, we applied unified methodology.
Thank you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you for the presentation. I haven't seen a lot of contemporary research that applied Habermas's theory of the colonization of the life world. So this was really interesting to see how this applies to contemporary empirical research. Now, although I could ask a lot of questions about the research methods applied, I'm going to ask you something about the trends which have been observed with this concept of inward and outward solidarity that you mentioned. I also agree that this concept of inward and outward solidarity is increasingly important in understanding the way democracies work today. Since the 90s, sociologists and political scientists like Robert Putnam have observed the general decline of this kind of solidarity, of norms of reciprocity, general patterns of trust, the ways that social networks are formed in the previous times compared to today, and so forth. I was wondering, how does this research inform on the way that these trends of declining solidarity have persisted until COVID-19, and what's changed after COVID-19? Because I think this, in some ways, perhaps until COVID-19, these patterns of solidarity, norms of reciprocity have been declining, but we are unsure how this changed in 2020 and until today.
Yes, thank you very much. I understand the question. I think solidarity, is a very important part and very important feature of civil society, and we experience that in each country, the solidarity inside the civil society actors, civil society organizations, and citizens just became much higher than usually and than generally before. So it was a kind of sudden increase and sudden increase, not just in generally solidarity, but somehow solidarity was able to turn into concrete activities. So people, in spite of the danger of the virus, left their homes, especially representatives of civil society organizations, and helped elderly people who couldn't leave their homes. They organized programs online for those who were not able to leave, obviously, and that was a period of time where when everybody had to stay at home. But this was a temporary phenomenon. So somehow the competition among organizations disappeared, and somehow the much more emphasis was on the cooperation and organizations contributed in certain actions without any kind of question, and it was so naturally done, I would say. But somehow after the very first 1.5, maybe 2 years of pandemic, this thing has dropped. So this was just a temporary situation, and the solidarity still was somehow was a kind of thing that was an ongoing trait, but somehow the competition came back much more, competition of resources. Somehow those organizations which collected donations during the pandemic assisted smaller organizations, and this has changed, and they started to compete for governmental sources or for other sources. So somehow it was really not a stable and an ongoing process. And now, when the war has started about a month ago in Ukraine, it became again a big issue. So especially in Hungary, for instance, where the migration was, the state totally forbid civil society organizations and NGOs to assist people who tries to migrate to Hungary or try to use Hungary as a transit country and migrate to Western Europe, it was actually declared to be a criminal act if an NGO provided any kind of information or any kind of help to migrants or refugees. So this was changed by the government some weeks ago, but actually this change located just the border between Hungary and Ukraine. So only the refugees from Ukraine, only those refugees could receive legally NGOs assistance who come from Ukraine, and a lot of in a day, I would say, when the refugees appeared on the border, several organizations, NGOs appeared on the border, and they started to do their assistance. Incredible donation, collection, very high level of collecting different kind of donations has started, and money, not just money, but different kind of articles and objects and things that refugees needed are collected. And these organizations provide, I think, incredibly important assistance, life-saving assistance for those people who flee from Ukraine, flee from the war. So, and now we can see again a kind of a revival of the solidarity. So somehow, as far as I can see, the crisis and this kind of crisis situation makes have a good impact on the solidarity, the inward and outward solidarity at the same time. Was it a good answer for your question?
Yeah, thank you very much. It is also my view that this change in solidarity, which may or may not exist, I don't know, it is something that we will have to empirically check with longitudinal research, but it represents an outlier, much like social capital research in disasters also represents some kind of outlier. But thank you very much.
Yeah, but it doesn't mean that, you know, we have to have always crises. So to keep up this kind of solidarity, somehow we should find a ways to hold or to maintain solidarity in civil society independently from crises. I think in our society, in each of our society, there are social crises. For instance, in Hungary, the Roma crisis. So, I mean, this, but we somehow, societies became neutral or became insensitive of these kind of crises, you know, because we live together with Roma poverty, we live together with a lot of things for a long time, and we accustomed it, we don't want to deal with it, and somehow we forget, or civil society forget solidarity in respect of these problems. But I think we should really raise attention and reinforce the crisis, or be conscious of the crises that we live together on a daily basis, and we should really keep up and maintain civil society solidarity in this respect.
There were two more questions, but unfortunately we're more than 10 minutes past our time limit, so I'm afraid we'll have to end the discussion here. Thank you very much for all your answers.
I will answer it online, okay? So I try to answer them online, if you don't mind.
Fine.
Okay, so write it in the chat and I will answer them. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you for your patience. I really misused the time a little bit. Okay?
Thank you for your participation in our symposium.
Thank you very much. It was my pleasure to participate, and have a good work and have a good conference for you. Thank you. Bye-bye. And I answer the questions in chat.
Yes, of course. I will do.